Okay, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about accommodations and modifications for assessment, looking at assessing kids with diverse abilities and especially thinking about kids with specific kinds of disabilities today. This isn't a special education course. There are entire courses dedicated to this topic. But today I just want to hit some of the highlights of issues to think about as a classroom teacher or as a principal in thinking about equity issues. Really, a lot of this course, as you realize, comes down to this concept of equity and whether or not students really have a fair shake at doing well. So today we're going to talk about a few topics. We're going to talk about accommodations versus modifications. I'm going to talk about typical kinds of accommodations, things that are generally considered to be non-approved accommodations. We're going to talk about construct issues because that's really what the core problem is with making accommodations and modifications to assessment procedures, is that we've changed the construct. And then finally, I'm going to set up an activity that folks can do at their discretion for adapting an assessment and using some typical kinds of individual accommodations. Alright, so let's look at the definition for accommodation versus modification. An accommodation is any action that's taken in response to a determination that an individual's disability requires a departure from the established testing protocol. So depending on the circumstance, each accommodation may include modifications of test administration processes or modification of the test content. No connotation that modification implies a change in the constructs being measured is intended. So an accommodation is a change in place, timing, other kinds of structural changes or differences. But if you're changing what you're measuring, it's no longer an accommodation. A modification, on the other hand, refers to changes made to the test that alter the construct being measured by the test. Okay, these changes now introduce noise or construct-irrelevant variance into the results of our test. So as a result, the scores on a test that has been modified may be unreliable, they may be invalid, but they're certainly not comparable to everyone else's test results. So let's look at some typical kinds of accommodations. One of the most common is modifying the presentation format. We can modify the medium that we use. We can administer this on a computer, or these are infrequent accommodations, Braille and sign language. If you look at the proportion of kids who have visual and auditory disabilities in school, it's actually a very tiny fraction of the total. Most students' disabilities are learning disabilities or communication disorders, which kind of impede their ability to understand what they're being asked to do. This is far more common than some of us might think of kids who can't see or can't hear or can't walk. Those are actually really very rare disabilities in our school systems. The other disabilities that I spoke of, in terms of learning disabilities, communication disorders, behavioral disorders, are much more common than are these. We can also modify the response format. We can have students point. We can use a tape recorder to record their responses. They could keyboard their responses. They can scribe. We can use a scribe, so an adult is there writing down what they say. And one of the issues, I think, with using a scribe is that staffing levels, and there's whether we can ensure that there's equity for students. In some schools we have lots of staff to assist students for doing scribing. In other schools there's not nearly the capacity within the school system to provide ed techs or other kinds of adults that could assist students with scribing their work. So I think even as we think about modifying tests and we think about the kinds of accommodations that we can provide, one of the core issues is equity. Do all students have equal access or even similar access to these kinds of assistive devices and to these kinds of help, where we have adults that can come in and provide specific services. Another genre of typical accommodations is related to modifying the timing of the accommodation. We could change the time of day. I had students, certainly as a special ed teacher in middle school, who did better in the morning or they did better in the afternoon, usually in the morning. We can change the duration of the sessions. We can change how long students are tested for. We can give them additional time. And I think one of the questions becomes then, if some students receive extra time to finish something, then should all students receive extra time? Interestingly, the question of whether all students should receive extra time, there was a study by Fuchs, Eaton, and Carnes in 2000, also by Hubert in 1999 and Schutz-Elliott and Crutchwell in 2001, really documenting that extra time as an accommodation typically doesn't improve everyone's scores. In fact, there's a real differential in terms of the improvement of scores. So where students who would normally be able to complete the test in the regular amount of time, if you give them more time, doesn't necessarily improve their scores. So it gives credence to the concept that extra time is a reasonable accommodation. The next one is modifying the test setting. And test settings can be changed in a number of different ways. We can go from being in a full group to a small group. We could change lighting conditions, or also just sort of setting conditions for students who are easily distracted. If you think of, I had some students in middle school, boys in particular, who really were easily distracted, and by putting them in a small group, kind of in a carrel kind of a situation where there were very few distractions, it was much easier for them to concentrate for short periods of time so that they could actually engage with the questions in the test. If you put them in the regular classroom, they just weren't paying attention. It was very difficult to get them to focus. There's a variety of reasons for that, but certainly modifying test setting is an issue that is pretty beneficial, I think, from my personal experience for a number of students. So sometimes accommodations simply aren't enough. When you have students, as many of you are currently teachers, know you've got students in your classes that are 2, 3, 4, sometimes grade levels behind their peers, and simply giving them extra time or giving them a different setting is not going to allow them to meaningfully engage in this test. You're going to have to do something different, something more drastic. And this is where we start looking at non-standard, what we call non-standard accommodations, or really what they are is modifications. So here are some non-standard accommodations, or really modifications. One is to use only a portion of the test. We can shorten the test. We can use only certain sections that the student's able to engage with directly. For example, maybe you have selected response items and you also have short constructed response items. And the selected response really are difficult for students to engage with because they just simply can't read and understand those questions. But they can do fairly well with the constructed response items. You might consider that. Another is to use an out-of-level test, which is basically if you're in mathematics and you're doing a 4th grade, maybe the student is really working on 2nd grade material, and so you would use a 2nd grade math test instead to assess how they're doing with what they're working on. The next is using an alternate test, and that's really kind of related to kind of the first one, which is around portions of a test, where you might use a different test altogether. You might use a test again that focuses on the kinds of skills or the kinds of content that the student's able to actually engage with and produce what they know. And then finally, we can use other forms of assessments. So instead of using a multiple choice or even a written essay, we can give a test orally. We can have the student do a demonstration. There are a variety of ways that we might consider having students demonstrate their proficiency in a different manner. I think it's really important, though, that we consider some of the issues that are involved with these non-standard accommodations or really modifications. Even though these things may be entirely appropriate, the impact of the changes that you've made are really not clear. For example, let's say that we give a student an out-of-level test in mathematics. The student's in the 8th grade, but is given the test that's normed for 4th graders. How can you use those results? How shouldn't they be used? Well, you certainly can't use those results to compare the performance of your 8th grade student with other 8th grade students. So they could be meeting the standards on this test, but it's meeting the standards for the 4th grade, not for the 8th grade that they're in. This was a procedure that was used in times past, not too long ago really, where students was required that they would be tested and kind of report out on their progress. And so schools or teachers would give them out-of-level tests, and they would report their progress right along with the students in the rest of that grade. And so we were really comparing apples and oranges. We were throwing in the 4th grade results with the 8th grade results, and it looked as though many more of the students were meeting the standards than in fact were. Those 4th grade results, though, it doesn't mean that they're not valid for that student. What they are is they give you a sense of where they're performing in relation to the material that they're working on. So let's say that they come back with a 4.6 grade level. Well, that tells you that if they're working through 4th grade material, they're making good progress. They're actually getting it, and that it's probably a fairly accurate level for them to be working on. If they're not performing well, we'll say that they're performing in the low 3rd grade level, or they're performing down and around the 15th percentile, even on the 4th grade material, then that tells you that perhaps that 4th grade material is still too difficult, or that they need better instruction. Conversely, if they're working on that 4th grade test, but they got a grade equivalent score of 6 point something, maybe that tells you that that 4th grade material may in fact be too easy. So there's a lot of valid uses for out-of-level tests, but you can't, one of them is not to simply lump in that student's results with everyone else in their grade. So again, some of the positive uses gives us diagnostic information about that student's performance, and we can make some program decisions. And the student's specific areas of strengths and needs emerge from these non-standard administrations, because unlike the grade level test that they might get every question wrong, they get some of these questions right and some of them wrong, presumably, in their out-of-level test. And that mixture of right and wrong answers really gives us that kind of diagnostic information that we can't get by simply giving them the 8th grade test where they get all of the questions wrong. When a student gets all of the questions right or all of the questions wrong, we've actually learned nothing about the student other than that they can or they can't do all of those questions. It doesn't really give us much in terms of diagnostics about that student, though. So out-of-level tests really are pretty useful in terms of this diagnostic information. Again, some of the misuses should not be reported in the same format as the tests that are regularly administered. They have to be reported anecdotally. Any norm reference scoring should be omitted. Remember, because they're out-of-level students taking these tests. So I spoke about grade equivalence a moment ago, but that's only for diagnostic information. It's not to report actual student levels. The next topic really comes back to the concept of constructs and violating constructs as a result of introducing accommodations or modifications to a test. And just to recall, a construct is some individual characteristic that we assume exists in order to explain some aspect of behavior or of learning. So, in other words, constructs are reflections of those kinds of skills that we want students to have, being good readers, being good writers, being proficient with mathematics computation. In other words, a construct is that thing that we say we're trying to measure. Hope, love, pride, all of those are constructs. Similarly, reading ability and problem-solving intelligence are also constructs. So our assessments strive to reflect these levels of competencies that a person has for some particular construct of interest. But one of the measurement problems is that when we give more time or we reduce the number of problems, the nature of what we're assessing is changed. And will our new results be equivalent to the results before? So in other words, are we still measuring the same thing? And can we use our results in the same way? So accommodations again help the test taker to reduce the irrelevant impact of their disability to participate in the assessment. Often, our results can be reliable and valid. Modifications, however, typically change what we're testing, and they do so in such a way that the results are usually unreliable and invalid for that test's original inferences. Okay, so it's not that the results are unreliable and invalid for the child, but in terms of comparing them with everyone else's responses, they are not equivalent. Universal design is a term that's borrowed from architecture, and some of you may have seen it. It was very much in vogue a few years ago. But in that medium, we see that universal design refers to access being built in at the time of the structure's design. So add-on access is quite obvious in this case. It's distracting and it can be expensive. You think, for example, of old buildings that have wheelchair ramps retrofitted to the front of them. They're not very attractive. However, access that's designed in from the start is more graceful, it's more logical, and it's more practical. So I'll contrast for a moment these two buildings, D.P. Corbett and Scheibel's Hall. Scheibel's has accessibility sort of added on. You've got to go in through the basement in order to get in with a wheelchair, for example, whereas D.P. Corbett is designed with the first floor at ground level. When we think about applying universal design to assessments, one promising development is in computer-based testing. We have multiple means of inputting information, and we have multiple ways to portray information on a computer. We also have what are called adaptive tests that can alter the sequence, the difficulty level, and the length of the test. And the GRE online is a good example. Some of you may have taken the GRE computer test, and that's a computer adaptive test. Another good example of this is the NWEA, where all students in a grade can take the NWEA, the Northwest Educational Assessment, that measures academic progress that they call the MAP tests. The NWEA is an interesting case where we can have two students, both of them in the 5th grade, one of them 2 grades above grade level and two grades below grade level, and they both can sit down and take that test, and the computer will automatically adjust the difficulty of the items to match that student's skill level so that they can both take a valid test. In other words, we're not going to have a situation where one student who's 2 grade levels above gets every question right, and a case where the student who's 2 grade levels below gets every question wrong. No. Instead, they're given questions of appropriate difficulty, and we see a pattern of responses that helps us to understand what they do and they don't know. Much more useful information. So in this way, most of our accommodations are largely eliminated, and so are some of the problems that are associated with them. I'll give you a couple of resources to take a look at, a little more information about universal design, because it is an interesting concept. One is the Center for Applied Special Technology, or CAST, and then the other is the National Center for Educational Outcomes. And these are both great organizations and good places for you to look for additional information if this is something of interest to you.